I was on the bathroom floor, my back against the tub, watching the tile grout blur in and out of focus, when I called my mother for the fourth time in 11 minutes. She picked up on the second ring. I remember that detail with a clarity that still makes my chest tight, because it meant she wasn't asleep, and she wasn't driving, and she wasn't in some dead zone out past the county line. She picked up on the second ring, and before I could say a single word, before I could even get out, "Mom, I need," she said, flat and fast, "Not now, Dana," and the line went dead. I was 34 years old, alone in my own bathroom, bleeding internally from a pregnancy I hadn't told a single member of my family about yet, and my mother had just hung up on me twice in under 15 minutes. I want to tell you that I knew right then that something was wrong beyond the obvious. But I didn't. I just thought she was busy. I thought maybe she was in the middle of something with my sister, some errand, some argument about paint colors for the guest room, anything. I didn't think she can see my name on her screen and she is choosing in this specific moment not to answer me. That thought came later, weeks later. And when it finally landed, it changed the way I understood everything that happened that afternoon, including the part where, 5 hours after my mother hung up on me twice, the hospital called her back, and she answered on the very first ring. Before I get into how that happened, I want to ask you something because I think about it more than I probably should. If you're watching this right now, tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is where you're sitting. Because for me, that day is frozen at 2:47 in the afternoon. That's the time stamped on my very first 911 call. I've looked at it more times than I can count. I need to know that somewhere out there right now while you're watching this, the clock is just moving normally for someone. It helps a little to picture that. My name is Dana Whitfield. I was a paralegal at a small family law firm in a mid-sized town I won't name, because some of the people in this story still live there, and I'm not interested in making their lives harder than the last 2 years already have. I want to tell you what happened to me, not for sympathy, though I won't pretend I don't still feel raw about parts of it, but because I think there's something in this story that a lot of people will recognize. That specific, quiet horror of realizing the people who are supposed to answer for you, without question, at any hour for any reason, didn't. And worse, that they had a reason of their own for not answering, and it had nothing to do with being busy, and everything to do with what they were doing to me behind my back. This didn't start on the bathroom floor. It started 8 months earlier in a hospital room that looked almost exactly like the one I'd end up in myself. My father, Walter Whitfield, died on a Tuesday in October, 4 days after his 68th birthday, of congestive heart failure that had been quietly getting worse for 2 years while he insisted he was fine, just tired. He died in the same regional hospital I would be wheeled into 8 months later, which is either a coincidence or the kind of thing that makes you superstitious about buildings. My dad was not a wealthy man, but he was careful. He'd bought 3 small rental duplexes in the 90s and early 2000s, back when the town was cheaper, and he'd paid them off slowly, one at a time, treating the rental income like a second, quieter salary. He also had a life insurance policy worth $250,000, taken out back when my mother was still working and they had 2 kids in braces. And he had the house, my childhood house, paid off outright. He named me executor of his estate, not my older sister, Renee, me. I want to be fair here because fairness matters to me even now. My dad didn't choose me because he loved me more. He told me himself about a year before he died, sitting at his kitchen table with a legal pad and a mechanical pencil, that he picked me because of my job. "You know how this works, Dana girl," he said. "You read this stuff for a living. Renee would drown in the paperwork and you know it." He wasn't wrong. Renee is a dental hygienist, sharp with people, terrible with forms. And by that point, my dad's finances had already gotten complicated in a way that would matter enormously later. Because 2 years before he died, when his heart problems first got serious, he'd signed a power of attorney giving Renee the authority to manage his day-to-day bills, his checking account, his medical scheduling. Not me. Renee lived 12 minutes from him. I lived 40 minutes away, working full-time, raising my son Milo on my own since my divorce 2 years before that. The POA made sense at the time. It really did. Someone needed to be close by, paying the electric bill, driving him to cardiology appointments, and that person was Renee. But it meant that for 2 years before my father died, Renee had grown used to being the one who controlled the money. The one who signed things, the one people called first. And then he died, and the will named me the sister who lived farther away, who saw him less in the day-to-day sense as the person now legally in charge of settling everything. The duplexes, the insurance payout, the house, all of it. I didn't understand in the beginning how much that single piece of paper, a 2-year-old power of attorney that had technically expired the moment my father died, would end up mattering. I didn't understand that Renee had spent 2 years feeling like the responsible one, the present one, the one who'd earned it, and that watching that authority transfer to me on paper in a lawyer's office would feel to her like being demoted in her own family. I found all of this out slowly. At the time, I just noticed that Renee got quiet at the reading of the will. Quiet in a way I recognized from childhood, the kind of quiet that meant something was going to happen later, somewhere I couldn't see it coming. The first 6 months of handling my father's estate were slow and tedious in the specific way probate always is: filing petitions, notifying creditors, getting the duplexes appraised, opening an estate bank account, requesting 15 different certified copies of the same death certificate for 15 different institutions that all insisted on their own original. I did most of it in the evenings after Milo went to bed, at my kitchen table, the same way my father had once done his own paperwork. Renee helped at first in small ways, forwarding me mail that came to the house, letting appraisers in. But somewhere around month 3, I started noticing small frictions that didn't quite make sense. She'd mention, almost in passing, things about the duplexes that she shouldn't have known yet, a comment about once the Birchwood unit sells before I'd even ordered the appraisal, or asking me, a little too casually, whether the estate account had cleared yet, in a way that suggested she was tracking the balance more closely than a grieving daughter usually does. I didn't push on it. I had a full-time job, a 8-year-old, and a father to grieve, and I told myself Renee was just anxious, the way people get anxious about money after a parent dies. I genuinely believed that. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until much later, pieced together from bank records and a title company file I had no business seeing until a judge ordered it turned over, was that Renee's husband, Mark, was in serious financial trouble. Mark ran a small residential construction outfit, 3 employees, mostly kitchen and bathroom remodels, and it had taken a beating over the previous 2 years. A lawsuit from an unhappy client, a truck that needed replacing, a slow winter that turned into a slow spring. By the time my father died, Mark owed just under $60,000 across 2 business lines of credit, and the bank had started sending letters that used words like default and acceleration. Renee knew this. My mother, I'd later learn, also knew this, and had quietly been helping Mark and Renee with smaller amounts here and there for over a year, $2,000 here, $3,000 there, pulled from her own modest savings. The kind of help a mother gives without telling her other daughter because it feels private, because it feels like it's nobody else's business. I understand that impulse. I don't resent my mother for wanting to help her daughter and son-in-law quietly. What I resent, what still, honestly, keeps me up some nights, is what came next, and the fact that when it mattered most, when I was the one who needed help, that same instinct to protect Renee overrode everything else, including whether I lived or died. Here's something I hadn't told anyone yet, not my mother, not Renee, not even Milo. 6 weeks before the day everything happened, I found out I was pregnant. I want to be honest about the complicated feelings around that, because this isn't a simple story and I'm not going to pretend it is. I was 34, divorced, raising an 8-year-old alone, and I was seeing someone carefully, slowly, nothing serious enough yet to introduce to my son. The pregnancy wasn't planned. I was still deciding how I felt about it, still turning it over at night, still not ready to say the words out loud to my family, especially not while we were all still raw from my father's death and tangled up in his estate. I'd had one early ultrasound at 7 weeks, and the doctor had flagged something she wanted to keep an eye on. The pregnancy's location wasn't clearly confirmed as being in the right place. She used the word inconclusive and told me to come back in 2 weeks for a follow-up, and if I had any sharp pain or heavy bleeding before then, to go straight to the ER. I remember nodding, filing it under things to worry about later, the way you do when you're a single mother juggling a full-time job and an estate and a secret. The day everything happened was a Thursday. It mattered that it was a Thursday, because Thursday was the day we, meaning me, my mother, and Renee, were all supposed to meet at my father's estate attorney's office at 4 o'clock to finalize the paperwork on selling one of the duplexes, the one on Birchwood Lane, the smallest of the 3, which the estate had agreed to sell to help cover taxes and split proceeds fairly among the three of us. That's the meeting I would miss. That's the meeting that, I'd later learn, went ahead without me anyway, just not at the attorney's office and not for the reason any of us had planned. At around 2:15 that afternoon, sitting at my desk at the law firm, I felt a cramping pain low on my right side that didn't feel like ordinary cramps. By 2:30 it had sharpened into something that made me grip the edge of my desk. By 2:40 I'd told my supervising attorney I felt sick, driven myself the 8 minutes home instead of to urgent care because I thought foolishly that I just needed to lie down, and by 2:45, I was on my bathroom floor, unable to stand, dialing 911 with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The 911 dispatcher's voice was calm in a practiced way that I now associate permanently with the smell of hospital antiseptic. She asked me my location, my symptoms, whether I could unlock my front door for the paramedics. I remember answering in short, breathless sentences, one hand pressed flat against my lower right abdomen as if I could hold something in place by force of will. "Ma'am, is there anyone who can be with you? A family member, a neighbor? I'll call my mom," I said. "She's 15 minutes away." That's when I made the first call to my mother. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I remember thinking distantly through the pain that she might be driving, that she might not have her phone on her. The paramedics arrived 9 minutes after my 911 call. I have the time-stamped report. I've read it more times than is healthy. And by the time they had me on the gurney in my own hallway, my blood pressure had already dropped low enough that one of them, a young paramedic named Julissa, said something to her partner in a tone that made my stomach drop even through the pain. "BPS 68/40, let's move." In the ambulance, with an IV already in my arm and oxygen tubing under my nose, I called my mother again. This was the second call, the one where she picked up on the second ring and said, "Not now, Dana," before the line went dead. I called Renee next, straight to voicemail. I texted her, "Renee, call me now, it's an emergency." No response. I called my mother a third time. It rang out. By the time the ambulance pulled into the ER bay, I'd called my mother 4 times and Renee twice, and I had exactly 0 missed call callbacks and 0 texts in return. The last thing I remember clearly before the ER swallowed me into the fast, efficient blur of triage. Blood draws, an ultrasound wand pressed hard against my abdomen. A doctor's face going carefully neutral in the way doctors' faces do when they're about to say something serious. Was calling my mother a 5th time from the hospital's own front desk phone because a triage nurse had asked, gently, "Is there someone who can come sit with you? You're going to need a decision maker here soon." That call, like the others, went unanswered. What I didn't know, what none of us in that ER knew, was that at that exact hour, a little after 3:30 in the afternoon, my mother and my sister were not ignoring their phones out of simple distraction. They were sitting in a small conference room at Marrow Title and Escrow, 20 minutes across town from the hospital, in the middle of signing closing documents on the sale of my father's Birchwood Lane duplex. A sale that, on paper, listed my consent as executor, even though I hadn't been in that room, hadn't seen those documents, and had no idea the closing had been moved up by 2 weeks and rescheduled without me. The doctor who came to talk to me in the ER, Dr. Anand, a woman with tired, kind eyes and a manner that didn't waste words, told me that the ultrasound showed a ruptured ectopic pregnancy, that I was bleeding internally, and that I needed emergency surgery within the hour. She asked, standard procedure, whether I had an emergency contact who could be reached, someone who needed to be informed and who could be present for post-operative decisions if needed. I gave her my mother's number and Renee's number, both because in the moment, some stubborn part of me still believed one of them would pick up if a hospital called instead of me. A nurse named Priya made the call from the nurse's station while I was being prepped. I know this because I asked her, weeks later, to walk me through exactly what happened, and she was kind enough to check the hospital's call log for me, since by then I'd started asking questions with a paralegal's precision that made people nervous. Priya called my mother's cell phone at 3:52 p.m. It rang twice, and my mother answered. I want to sit with that for a second because it's the detail that undid something in me the first time I heard it. 2 rings. My own calls made from my own name, from a number my mother had saved under Dana Red for a decade, went unanswered 5 separate times over the span of an hour and 10 minutes. A call from an unfamiliar hospital switchboard number, A number my mother had never seen before in her life, got picked up in 2 rings. Priya told me my mother sounded confused, then alarmed, once she understood who was calling and why. She said my mother asked, "Wait, Dana called 911? When?" As though the idea that I might have needed her in the last hour was new information, arriving for the very first time at 3:52 in the afternoon. I went into surgery at 4:10 p.m. The surgeon removed my right fallopian tube along with the ruptured pregnancy, stopped the internal bleeding, and by the time I woke up in recovery a little after 6, groggy and cold and disoriented, my mother was sitting in the chair beside my bed. She looked like she'd been crying. She held my hand and told me she was so sorry she hadn't understood. She'd had her phone on silent for a work thing, that was the word she used. A work thing. Even though she hadn't worked in 11 years, and she hadn't seen any of my calls until the hospital rang her. I believed her. I want to be honest about that too. Lying in a recovery bed, drained and hollowed out and grieving a pregnancy I hadn't even fully processed as real yet, I believed my mother's story completely, because the alternative that she'd seen my name 5 times in an hour and chosen, deliberately not to answer, was too ugly to hold on to while I was still hooked up to a morphine drip. It would take me nearly 3 weeks to stop believing her. I stayed in the hospital 2 nights. Renee visited once on the 2nd day with a bouquet of grocery store carnations and an apology that felt rehearsed, the kind of apology that's really a request for forgiveness rather than an account of what happened. "I'm so sorry, Dana, my phone was in my bag the whole time, I didn't even feel it buzzing," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. I noticed that detail, the not quite meeting my eyes, but I filed it under grief and awkwardness, not deception. I had no reason yet to look closer. The thing that eventually made me look closer wasn't suspicion of my family. It was, almost embarrassingly, an insurance dispute. 3 weeks after I came home, still healing, still on modified duty at the firm, I got a call from the estate attorney's office. The same attorney handling my father's estate, asking why I hadn't come in to co-sign the final Birchwood Lane closing documents, since the sale had, according to the title company, already closed 2.5 weeks earlier. I remember sitting very still at my kitchen table, the phone against my ear, feeling something in my chest go cold and slow. "Closed," I said. "It closed without me?" The attorney, a careful man named Mr. Ferris, went quiet for a second too long. "Dana," he said, "the paperwork we received from the title company includes your signature on the executor consent form, dated the same day as the closing." I hadn't signed anything that day. That day I'd been in an ambulance, then in surgery, then in a recovery bed, then discharged with a follow-up appointment for a wound check. I had not been anywhere near a title company. I had not signed a single document. Mr. Ferris asked me to come into his office as soon as I could, and to bring my phone. That night, lying awake next to Milo's nightlight glow spilling under his bedroom door, I did something I hadn't let myself do yet. I opened my phone's call log and scrolled back to that Thursday. 5 calls to my mother, 2 to Renee, all logged, all time-stamped, all, and this is the detail that changed everything for me, marked not as missed, but 3 of them, including the second call where my mother had answered and said, "Not now," logged as active calls with a duration. 10 seconds, 6 seconds, 4 seconds. They hadn't missed my calls. They had answered or seen them ring long enough to register and let them go. I want to describe what it feels like to look at a call log like that because I don't think people understand it until it happens to them. It isn't a dramatic, cinematic kind of anger. It's quieter and colder than that. It's the specific, disorienting vertigo of realizing that a story you've been told and believed and repeated to yourself as comfort. She just didn't see it, her phone was on silent, doesn't match a piece of hard, unemotional data sitting right there on a screen. I didn't call my mother that night. I didn't trust my own voice yet. Instead, I did what 4 years of working in a law office had trained me to do. I started building a timeline. I pulled my full phone records from my carrier the next morning, not hard to request, just an app and a login. I requested my hospital's own internal call log through the patient portal's request form, the same one Priya had shown me. I asked Mr. Ferris carefully, without yet accusing anyone of anything, for a full copy of the Birchwood Lane closing file, every document, every signature page, every date stamp. What I was building, without fully admitting it to myself yet, was a case, not against strangers, against my own mother and sister. The closing file arrived from Mr. Ferris 4 days later in a manila envelope thick enough that I had to steady it with both hands. I sat at my kitchen table after Milo went to bed and went through it page by page, the way I'd been trained to review discovery documents at work, methodically, without letting my eyes skip ahead to conclusions. The executor consent form had my name typed at the top correctly. It had a signature at the bottom that was, at a glance, a reasonably close approximation of mine, the same looping D, the same flat cross on the H in Whitfield. But it wasn't mine. I knew my own signature the way you know your own face, and there was something subtly wrong about the pressure, the spacing, the way the tail of the Y curled the wrong direction. I found something else in that file too, something that made the timeline snap into a shape I hadn't wanted to see. The closing had originally been scheduled for the following Monday, 4 days after my emergency. It had been moved up, at Renee and Mark's request, to that Thursday. My emergency happened at 2:45 p.m. The closing appointment at Merritt Title and Escrow was scheduled for 3:00 p.m. the very same afternoon. They hadn't just ignored my calls because they were busy elsewhere. They had rescheduled a fraudulent closing to happen while I would supposedly be at a meeting I'd never agreed to, using a signature that wasn't mine. And when my actual real emergency started ringing their phones in the middle of that meeting, they let it ring, because answering might have meant unraveling their own plan before it closed. I didn't confront anyone yet. This is the part of the story where I think a lot of people, understandably, want me to have marched over to my mother's house and thrown that manila envelope down on her kitchen table. I understand the impulse. I felt it too more than once, usually around 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. But I'd spent 4 years watching family law cases get won and lost based on what evidence existed on paper versus what people simply believed in their gut. And I knew that a confrontation without proof would get me nothing except a wounded, defensive family circling the wagons before I'd even gathered what I needed. So instead, I went back to Mr. Ferris, and for the first time, I told him plainly what I suspected. That the signature on the executor consent form wasn't mine, and that I believed the closing had been deliberately timed to happen while I was medically incapacitated, using a forged document. Mr. Ferris didn't look surprised, which told me something on its own. He told me, carefully, that forensic handwriting analysis on a disputed signature typically costs between $800 and $1,500, and that if I wanted to pursue this formally, as executor on behalf of the estate, rather than as an angry daughter, I'd need to file a petition with the probate court to compel production of the original documents and the title company's closing file in full, including notary records. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Over the following 2 weeks, Mr. Ferris filed the petition. The court granted it without much friction, since as executor I had clear standing to challenge any transaction involving estate property. What came back once the title company complied was the notary's logbook. A physical requirement in our state. Every notarized signature has to be recorded by hand, with the signer's ID information in a bound ledger the notary keeps for years. The notary who'd stamped the executor consent form was a woman named Sharon Depew. I didn't recognize the name at first. It was Mr. Ferris who found the connection, cross-referencing an old family Christmas card list my father had kept in his files, of all things. Sharon Depew was Mark's second cousin. She worked part-time at the same title company handling the Birchwood Lane sale, and according to her own notary log, she had notarized Dana Whitfield's signature at 3:04 p.m. that Thursday using, per the ledger's ID field, a photocopy of my driver's license that Renee had apparently kept from years earlier. When I'd asked her to hold onto a spare copy, just in case, during a stretch when I was worried about identity theft after a data breach at my old bank. The evidence wasn't circumstantial anymore. It was a paper trail with names, dates, and a family connection sitting right at the center of it. I want to pause here and be honest about something because I think it matters to how the rest of this unfolded. Even with the notary log in front of me, even with a forensic handwriting examiner Mr. Ferris hired confirming, in a formal written report, that the signature showed significant indicators of simulation rather than genuine execution. Even with all of that, some small, stubborn part of me still wanted an innocent explanation. I called my mother not to accuse her yet, just to ask carefully what she remembered about that Thursday. She told me again the story about her phone being on silent for a work thing. I asked her gently where she'd been that afternoon. There was a pause on the line I will never forget. Long enough that I could hear, faintly, a television in the background, the particular white noise of a house that thought it was having an ordinary evening. "We were finishing up some paperwork on your dad's place," she said finally. "Renee handled most of it. I was just there for support." "What time?" I asked. "Around 3, I think." "Why?" I told her as steadily as I could manage that I'd been in an ambulance at 3 o'clock. That I'd called her 4 times between 2:45 and 3:50. And that hospital records showed a nurse had reached her on the very first try, at 3:52, using a number she'd never seen before. The silence that followed was long enough that I actually said, "Mom," to make sure the call hadn't dropped. When she spoke again, her voice had changed completely, smaller, faster, the voice of someone caught rather than someone comforting a daughter. "Dana, I didn't know it was serious. I saw your name and I thought you were calling about the closing. I thought you were going to be upset that we moved it up without telling you, and I just didn't want to deal with it in the middle of signing. I swear to God I didn't know you were in an ambulance." That single sentence told me 2 things at once. First, that she'd seen my calls in real time and chosen not to answer, exactly as the phone log showed. And second, the part that actually made my hands go cold, sitting at my own kitchen table, that she'd known in the moment that they were moving up the closing without telling me. She hadn't been a bystander to Renee and Mark's plan. She'd known it was happening behind my back, and she'd sat in that room anyway and let my calls ring out anyway, because unraveling the secret in that moment felt more urgent to her than finding out why her daughter was calling 5 times in an hour. The full shape of what happened took another 6 weeks to assemble completely, mostly through documents Mr. Ferris pulled during the probate court's discovery process. Since by then I'd formally filed an objection to the Birchwood Lane sale and a petition asking the court to surcharge Renee for breach of fiduciary duty. Given her prior role under the now expired power of attorney and her direct involvement in the fraudulent closing, here's what the bank records, the title company file, and eventually a deposition transcript revealed, layer by layer. First layer. Mark's construction business had 2 credit lines totaling just under $60,000 in past due balances, with the bank threatening to call the loans and pursue Mark and Renee's personal assets, including their home, since Mark had personally guaranteed both lines 2 years earlier during a slow stretch. Second layer. Renee had proposed to Mark roughly 7 weeks before my father's death the idea of selling the Birchwood Lane duplex quickly once probate opened. Arguing to him, this came out in a text exchange the court compelled Mark to produce, that Dad's place is basically free money sitting there, and Dana's going to drag this out for a year, being careful about it. The estate's own accounting later confirmed the duplex sold for $11,000 under its appraised value, to a buyer who happened to be a longtime client of Mark's construction business, in what looked, once you saw the pattern, like a discount arranged for speed rather than a fair market transaction. Third layer. Renee had kept a photocopy of my driver's license from years earlier and had given it to Sharon Depew, her husband's cousin, to use as ID verification for a signature that was never actually mine. Sharon's deposition, when it finally happened, was almost worse than I expected, not because she seemed cruel, but because she seemed almost bored by the whole thing, describing it as just helping family move some paperwork along. As though notarizing a fraudulent signature on a $250,000 estate asset was a favor on the level of watering someone's plants while they were on vacation. Fourth layer, and the one that hurt the most. My mother's 2 years of quietly covering small amounts of Mark and Renee's debt, the $2,000 here, $3,000 there, meant that by the time my father died, she was emotionally and in a smaller way financially invested in Mark and Renee's financial survival in a way she had never been invested in mine, because I had never needed the money. I had a steady job, a modest but manageable life, no debts calling the bank on me. My stability, ironically, was part of what made it easy for my family to assume I would be fine, that I could afford to be inconvenienced, delayed, ignored, in a way Renee and Mark supposedly could not afford to be. I don't think my mother ever consciously decided that my emergency mattered less than Renee's debt. I think, if you'd asked her in that title company conference room, she would have said she loved us both equally. But in the 58 seconds it took my third unanswered call to ring out, in the specific choice to let it ring rather than step into the hallway and answer, her actions made a decision her heart might never have consciously agreed to. That gap between what people believe about themselves and what their actions actually show under pressure is, I've come to think, the real subject of this whole story. The probate case took just over 5 months from the day I filed my objection to the day it resolved. I want to walk through that stretch honestly because it wasn't the satisfying, fast unraveling you sometimes see in these kinds of stories. It was slow, expensive, and exhausting, layered with setbacks that made me doubt, more than once, whether pursuing it was worth what it was costing me emotionally. The first setback came almost immediately. Renee's own attorney, once she hired one, argued that the discrepancy in the signature was a matter of interpretation, and that I was, in his words, attempting to weaponize a family tragedy for financial gain, pointing to the ectopic pregnancy and hospitalization as though my seeking accountability was somehow opportunistic rather than the reason I'd started looking in the first place. That framing stung more than I expected. For about 2 weeks, I genuinely wondered if pursuing this made me the villain in some version of this story, if grief and anger were making me see conspiracy where there was only carelessness. What steadied me was rereading the forensic handwriting report, plain and unemotional on the page, and the notary ledger with Sharon Depew's own handwriting recording a signature event that had never happened the way she'd logged it. Evidence doesn't care about narrative framing. That's what finally let me stop second-guessing myself. The second setback was financial. Between the forensic examiner's fee, additional filing costs, and Mr. Ferris's hours mounting as the case dragged on, I spent just over $11,000 of my own savings pursuing the objection, money I wouldn't necessarily recover even if I won, since the estate itself was tied up until the case resolved. There were nights I sat with that number and felt genuinely sick, wondering if I was bankrupting my own peace of mind chasing a principle. The third setback was quieter and harder. Milo started asking why we didn't see Grandma Carol or Aunt Renee anymore, why holidays felt different, why I got quiet and short-tempered some evenings after phone calls with Mr. Ferris. I had to find age-appropriate ways to explain that grown-ups sometimes hurt each other badly enough that fixing it takes a long time, without making my 8-year-old carry the details of what had actually happened. But there were small wins too, and they mattered. The State Notary Licensing Board opened its own investigation into Sharon Depew after Mr. Ferris forwarded the forensic report, and she voluntarily surrendered her commission rather than face a formal revocation hearing. The title company, facing its own liability exposure once it became clear one of its closings involved a fraudulent signature, cooperated fully with every document request rather than risk being named a defendant themselves. And slowly, methodically, the case built toward a hearing date. The hearing took place on a Tuesday in April, almost exactly 7 months after my father died and nearly 6 months after the day I nearly died myself. I sat at a long table in a courtroom that smelled like old carpet and coffee, with Mr. Ferris beside me, and watched my mother and my sister sit at a similar table 15 feet away, not looking at me, not looking at each other either. The judge, a measured woman named Judge Ockhaffer, had clearly read every page of the file, because she moved through the facts efficiently, pausing only twice. Once when the forensic examiner testified in careful technical language that the signature on the consent form showed clear indicia of forgery inconsistent with natural signature variation, and once when the hospital call log was entered into evidence alongside my personal phone records, laid out side by side on a single exhibit page. 5 outgoing calls from Dana Whitfield between 2:47 and 3:50 p.m., all unanswered or actively declined. 1 incoming call to Carol Whitfield's phone from an unlisted hospital extension at 3:52 p.m., answered within 2 rings. I watched my mother's face when that exhibit went up on the courtroom's small screen. She didn't cry, not there. She just looked at it for a long moment, the way you look at a photograph of yourself from an angle you've never seen before, like she was seeing the shape of what she'd done laid out in a format too clean to argue with. Judge Ockhaffer's ruling, delivered about 3 weeks later in writing, unwound the Birchwood Lane sale entirely, voiding the closing and ordering the buyer, who was found not to have known about the forgery, to be made whole through a title insurance claim, while the property itself reverted to the estate to be sold properly, with my full participation, once probate concluded. The court surcharged Renee personally for breach of fiduciary duty tied to her prior role under the power of attorney, ordering her to repay the $11,000 discount from her own share of the eventual corrected proceeds, plus interest calculated from the date of the fraudulent closing. Mark was not criminally charged. The district attorney's office, after reviewing the file, decided a civil remedy through probate court adequately addressed the harm, though the notary board's revocation of Sharon Depew's commission remained on the public record permanently. I chose not to pursue anything further against my mother directly. Mr. Ferris told me I had grounds to, given how clearly she'd known about the plan in real time. I decided in the end that I didn't want a courtroom to be the place where my relationship with my mother finished dying. I wanted to leave at least a narrow door open, even if I wasn't sure yet whether I'd ever walk back through it. It's been just over a year now since that Thursday afternoon. I want to tell you honestly where things stand because I think tidy endings do a disservice to stories like this one. Renee and Mark's marriage didn't survive the fallout. I don't take satisfaction in that, not really, even on my hardest days. I think financial pressure and secrecy corrode things slowly regardless of what a court decides. And by the time the ruling came down, there wasn't much left between them to save. Mark's construction business closed its doors 4 months after the hearing. I hear secondhand that he's working for someone else's crew now, and I don't ask for more detail than that. My relationship with Renee is, at present, non-existent. She's tried twice to reach out, once with a text that read only, "I hope you're doing okay," which I didn't answer, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely don't know yet what an honest answer would look like. My relationship with my mother is the one that surprises me most. It isn't repaired. It may never be fully repaired, but it isn't gone either. We see each other every few weeks now, careful, a little formal, the way you might visit a relative recovering from a long illness, polite, present, but not yet trusting. She's told me more than once some version of "I don't know how I let it happen," and I believe that she means it, even if I'm still not sure it's enough. Physically, I'm healthy. The surgery left me with one fewer fallopian tube and a scar I don't think about most days. Milo is 9 now, thriving, blessedly unaware of most of the details, though old enough now to notice that some holidays look different than they used to. If there's a single thing I keep coming back to, a year later, it isn't the forged signature, or the money, or even the affair Mark and Renee's marriage couldn't survive. It's that 58 seconds I mentioned earlier, the length of time my third unanswered call rang out while my mother sat in a conference room, watching my name flash on her screen, choosing to let it ring. I think in the end that's the real lesson buried in all of this, if there is one. It was never really about the duplex or the $11,000 or even the forgery. It was about what gets revealed in the specific, unglamorous moment when someone has to choose, in real time, between the person calling and the thing they're protecting. My family chose that Thursday and the hospital's own switchboard. A random, impersonal number none of them had ever seen before ended up proving, more clearly than any argument I could have made, exactly what that choice had been. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why a stranger's number got answered faster than mine did. I've stopped trying to force that question into an answer that makes sense. Some things I think you're only meant to carry, not solve. This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment and reflection. If it resonated with you, I hope it's because somewhere in it, you recognize the difference between the people who show up for you and the people who only answer when they don't recognize the number.